We are extremely fortunate that Dr. Tyler White is with us today to present Global Affairs at a Crossroads, the Future of Freedom. Dr. White is an associate professor of practice and director of the National Security Program at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He is also the faculty lead for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence Center for Academic Excellence at UNL. Dr. White graduated from UNL in 2010 with his PhD in political science. His research interests have focused on national security topics including intelligence studies, United States nuclear policy, and United States foreign policy and deterrence. Dr. White has also focused heavily on curriculum development, creating the national security minor, as well as the core, introduction, and capstone courses for that minor. And as you will see, Dr. White is a terrific teacher. On a personal note, Dr. White and his wife, Elise, who is a Lancaster County juvenile court judge, have two boys, Gavin and Luke, who attend Buckhorn Elementary, and they also have Ricklick, a great big Labrador who makes life interesting for the family. And in their spare time, they enjoy traveling and scuba diving. So we're very fortunate that you can tell that Dr. White has a very, very busy schedule, so we're very glad that he was able to take time to visit with us today, and I'm going to turn the program over to him right now.
Thank you. That happens to me all the time. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to say what a privilege it is to be here today. I see so many familiar faces out there, and it's a real privilege because I am only here from a lot of the work that you all did, and I'm very well aware of that. And I see, former work colleagues and mentors and teachers myself. So I won't tell you that I think this fall I'm coming up on my 20th year of instruction at the University of Nebraska. So I've been doing this for a while. I feel really bad for that first class I taught. I'm not really sure what I told them. They are, I think about them a lot, where they are today and where I led them wrong. But this is something that is a little bit in my wheelhouse, but something I care deeply about, and so I'm excited to have a conversation with you today. There is a lot of political science on all of these different kinds of things, but one of the things I like to do is I like to sort of take the broader lessons and then make it a little more easily understandable for the audience to engage you in discussion and to engage you in learning. I think that's one of the most important things, and making things accessible is the goal. So as we're going along, if there's anything that you have a question about, we can talk about it. I do think there's time at the end for questions, and I'm certainly happy to entertain that. I did ask to go today because I was hoping, with the NCAA tournament starting, you all would be watching and I wouldn't have to perform, but you came, so I'll do my best to entertain you for the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll go to questions and go from there. So thank you again, Pam, for the wonderful introductions. 30 to 40% of that is true. I'll let you figure out which one as we go along. So I want to talk about the future of freedom. I just want to say I grew up in a time in which the Cold War was winding down and then it was over, and the United States was the most powerful entity to ever probably exist in human history. And a lot of the things that you grew up as a kid thinking about was the idea of democracy and freedom and spreading markets and all those different kinds of things. And I came into into the area of political science because I was a high school policy debater and I was really interested in the world. And my mom and dad will tell you my grades and other places suffered, but I found the thing that I really wanted to do. And so when I got to college, I had a chance to learn so much from so many amazing people about the way the world works. And when you sit there and you look at history, I spent a lot of time in history, I took grad courses in history, you realize we are kind of living in a special moment in a lot of ways. We're living in a moment of plenty, we're living in a moment in which a lot of people throughout the world have more freedom than they have had before. And I think when I was younger, I like a lot of other people, including some prominent political scientists, thought that history was over and that the debate over democracy versus autocracy had largely been settled and that we were moving into a new era in which we were going to see more freedom throughout the world. And I'll talk about how political scientists sort of understood that. And now we're facing something a little bit different, and now we're facing some serious questions about where we go from here. And I want to talk about those and give you some examples, and then I want to talk about what we can do about it. So I think it's always good to start with a roadmap, and like Dr. Griswold, sometimes I end up in the complete wrong direction, but if I can give myself some structure, at least you know where we're going to go. So today I want to talk about some definitions, very simple definitions of things that we're going to be talking about. I find in political discourse today, everybody has a different definition of everything. So let's come together and find a couple that we can all rely on together. I want to talk about trends for freedom and democracy across the world. I want to talk about external threats. I want to talk about internal threats. I want to talk about what's at stake. And then at the end, I feel like if you're going to have empowering conversations, you have to be able to leave these things with an idea of what you can do to solve the problem. Because I feel like there are so many things out in the world that you feel like you have no control over, and it takes up all of your attention. But I do think we actually have more power than we think, and we're going to talk about that and have a discussion. So let's talk about definitions. What is a democracy? Democracies, they come in all different flavors and sizes. There's a bunch of different kinds of democracies. Some democracies are they're all works in progress, to be honest with you. But we shouldn't take the idea of democracy as being static for granted. Democracies are constantly changing. It's a basic understanding, a basic definition of democracy as a form of government where citizens have representation. And they have a role in the making and enforcement of those laws. And this is an important word, decisions are made through compromise. Decisions are made through compromise. And we place a heavy emphasis, particularly in Western democracies, on that sort of civil, economic, political, and social rights. Now, there's big debates about this. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was written by an American, the United States itself has not adopted all of those. They've adopted one set, but not the other. They've adopted the sort of civil, political, but not the economic, right? So even within democratic societies, there are debates over what we consider to be, a benefit or a feature of the democracy that we've chosen. We're going to talk a little bit about populism today. Populism is something that we have seen a lot of. I went to daycare in the basement of the Prairie Populist. Yes, blame James Bryan. I went to daycare in his basement. Not when he was alive. My parents worked at Bryan Hospital, and they were like, what are we going to do with this house? I got an idea. Let's put the kids in the basement. That is so creepy when it comes out, when I say it like that. But that's what they did. He was considered a prairie populist, right? Populism is happening across the world. There's two different kinds of populism that we want to talk about. Really, we want to talk about thin populism. That's the kind we're seeing today. It's a much more simplistic view of us versus them. And it doesn't have a deep ideology attached to it. We know who we are, we know who they are, and we don't like them, and we want to distance ourselves from them in some way or shape or form. Thick populism, we saw a lot more of this in the 20th century, and this had ideological roots on both the left and the right. So a lot of times thick populism is animated by socialism or fascism or some kind of guiding ideological principle. And so there's thought leaders, I think, that oftentimes are pushing this type of populism. But populism at the end of the day is a group of people sort of deciding, that they want to have the ability to have the world just the way that they want. And oftentimes it has some sort of deep-seated corrosive effects on fair play, right, which we want to talk about in a moment. Autocracy, that's a state ruled by one person with absolute power, right? So that's like my house. My wife is the owner. My in-laws are here, so I can't. But we see a rise in autocratic behavior, autocratic tendencies, and autocrats throughout the world, and I'm going to give you some examples of that in just a second. And then totalitarianism. This is the one in which the state wants you to be subservient on all levels to it. So it wants not just control over you, it wants control over your thinking and your movements and all of the different things that you do in your life. And so I think a lot of times people will confuse autocracy and totalitarianism. I think both of them are bad, but they are bad in different ways, right? autocracies sometimes can slip into totalitarianism. Okay, we'll talk about some examples there. So what are the trends? So when I was growing up, everything seemed like it was moving in the right direction. Samuel Huntington, who's a famous academic, who's written a lot of different things, some of them controversial, some of them not so controversial, but he pointed out these waves of democracy, right? Most of human history is marked by autocratic rule. I mean, if you think about it, right? When we think about the Founding Fathers or we think about the French Revolution, these were kind of the first inklings of democratic self-rule. Now, when we think about it, the Founding Fathers put forth a democratic system that is very exclusive, but it was also very different and new. And I think one of the amazing things about the United States of America is we have struggled to grow that and grow that and grow that franchise bigger and wider, including more and more people into it, right? But you can see, for like most of human, this goes back to 1800, but for most of human history, there has been, like, usually a dude who's, you know, I'm going to tell you what you can and cannot do. If you're going to live in my fiefdom, if you're going to live in my kingdom, if you're going to live in my empire, whatever it is. Autocracy is the way that human beings have oftentimes ordered their affairs. It's might makes right, and let me tell you, there is a long, distinguished history of human misery attached with these types of rulings, right? And what we saw was, I mean, look at when we start seeing at the beginning of the 20th century, all of a sudden we start seeing upticks. There's just a few here, right? The French, the Americans, the British, nominally all have what you could consider to be early democracies. And they also have colonies, right? So as things move on, we begin to see more and more countries beginning to dabble in, experiment with self-rule. And these are the three waves he talks about. So aftermath of World War I, we see a whole bunch of new ones. Decolonization, which happens after World War II, and then the decline of communism. And so in the 1990s, we saw a whole bunch of new democracies sprouting across the world, in Asia and Africa and all kinds of other places. So, congratulations, we're good to go. And we can stop worrying about this because democracy has won. But we now know that's not true. We now know that we are experiencing an era of democratic backsliding, right? So backsliding is another one of those terms I didn't put up there because I think it's fairly self-evident as to what this is. And what you can see is there are a few democracies who are improving. And we do have evidence of this, and I'm going to talk about some bright spots here in a minute. But overall, what we can see is that in a lot of places we're seeing declines in democratic processes and protections for citizens. And that's not just happening in places that are sort of remote. This is happening in places that you probably are all familiar with, maybe have lived in or visited. And we're going to talk about some of the instances of that. But as we can see, this is a rapidly, sort of increasing trend. And I think we have to start asking ourselves a question about whether or not we're taking democracy for granted. And if we are, what are some of the things that we can do to reverse that? If we look at the places where we're seeing the biggest retrenchment, some of these places aren't necessarily surprising. Turkey, who is a NATO ally and has oftentimes been in the conversation to join the European Union. This is a country that, for a long time, the military was the one to protect the democracy. When somebody would come in to undermine the democracy, there would be a coup, a pro-democratic coup, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But with the ruling of Erdogan, he has really cracked down on this. There's a whole bunch of reasons he will give you as to why this is the case, and one of them are internal security problems, right? They have problems with Kurdish independence movements. There's a big debate of whether or not they can be considered terrorist groups. They're very sensitive about this. But you can see in some of these places, Venezuela is another good example. Venezuela is an example in which sort of a ruling junta got a hold of the state and never let it go. And they're still dealing with that problem today. But a lot of these places they're fragile, right? And those democracies are fragile. And it's amazing how when you have something that's that fragile, it can go away or it can decline or it can erode quickly. we take for granted the institutions that we have here. Our institutions are fairly old. And so we grow up in a consolidated democracy where we understand that that's the only game in town. Larry Diamond sort of coined this term, consolidated democracy, where everyone just kind of agrees that this is the way things are done. A lot of these states, there are people within living memory in which democracy was not the way that the state was ruled. And so when things don't go well, they say this democracy thing isn't maybe working out for us. Or if the institutions are weak, someone gets a hold of the reins of power and they erode those institutions in order to insulate their own power. So that's the story in a lot of these different places where you're seeing backsliding. And the places that you don't want to live. This is not necessarily a surprising list, right? Syria, for all intents and purposes, in a lot of places is a failed state. It's a failed state in which the dictator was able to sort of hang on after an incredibly brutal civil war. It's given safe haven to groups associated with Al-Qaeda and other things. But in North Korea, there's some fantastic accounts written on North Korea that are worth your time, worth reading. But this is as close to a totalitarian state, I think, as we're going to find. We see an ally there, Saudi Arabia, which is a theocracy, essentially controlled by one family, where women in particular don't have rights, but there's also a really entrenched class structure there as well that can be very oppressive. But a lot of these places, with the exception of sort of Saudi Arabia, Turkmenistan, you could argue, and North Korea, they're dealing with ongoing wars or ongoing political instability, which is a huge contributor to a decrease in freedom. Remember the Arab Spring? I remember the Arab Spring. I remember watching Tahrir Square on my computer in my office, thinking to myself, we're witnessing a wonderful history unfolding. When the protesters were in Tahrir Square and the military turned the guns of the tanks away from the protesters. I still sort of get goosebumps thinking about that, because that's possibility, right? The possibility that these people are going to earn the franchise, they're going to earn these freedoms that they were so, they so badly wanted. This was started actually in Tunisia when a fruit vendor lit himself on fire in protest of draconian policies by the Tunisian government. And it spread throughout the Arab world. And we all were hoping and expecting that this was going to be a game changer in the region. And as we've seen, it hasn't been. Tunisia is better off today, but they're backsliding. Egypt got better for a little while and then plateaued. And even the wealthiest state on here, Bahrain, is getting less and less free. And this flies in the face of a theory that we had going in the 1990s, that this sort of new way of creating a global economy was going to, by opening up markets, we were going to open up freedom. And this was the way we thought about China. We thought Chinese democracy is just around the corner once they have a free market system, because a free market system allows people to choose, gives them more freedom. And when they're allowed to choose economic outcomes, or they're allowed to have more freedom, they're going to demand more, right? And as we're going to find out here in a minute, we were completely wrong. In fact, technology has actually made it easier to erode a democracy than to unleash the forces that will make a democracy very difficult to erode. Even in the United States, we're seeing decreases in freedom. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but it comes from kind of two places. One, from a more powerful executive, and two, state and local laws, mostly state laws, that are focused on voting and some of these other kinds of things. The United States is a weird system in that, we have a president that's really empowered to do a lot of things. For the vast majority of human history, of American history, very different. The three branches of government really performed a check and balance. As the world gets more complicated and as the world moves faster, the executive eats up more and more of that space, right? So one person now can make more decisions, and this happened. We saw great leaps in this, particularly in the early 20th century, and in other areas where now the president is dependent on more and more to make these decisions. Is that a good thing? Some people would say the world is moving really quickly and that we need to have an executive that can respond very quickly. And other people would say, but the American system is set up to make decisions very slowly, right? And to have these multiple checks and balances that work their way through. And I don't know what the right answer is, to be honest, because there's a whole bunch of arguments that can be made in both directions. But it does create the possibility too, where an executive order, for instance, can have a real deleterious effect on your liberty. Okay, so I've said democracy is great and we're having a hard time these days, but I haven't made the case as to why democracies are good, right? And I think this is the case that's not being made. I think this is the discussion that we're not having. People say democracy, people say government. They have their own way of thinking about it, and so many people are disenchanted with democracy. And sometimes I think I go back and I ask, well, what are your expectations? And what is your level of commitment, right? Democracies are very difficult things to grow and maintain. And they require all of us to do something in order to maintain the democratic government. It requires citizens to be active and aware and informed, right? A lot of times, when you have an autocratic government, they don't ask the citizens to do anything, right? And as a result, they don't give you anything. You don't have rights. So when they say freedom isn't free, it's more than just being willing to serve in the military. It's more than just being willing to, vote every 4 years. It requires that we think about the virtues of democracy as a system and then invest in those virtues. And I think that that's one of the missing pieces in the common discourse today. Democracies give us a whole bunch of really good things. Things that we see every day and we take for granted every day. Democracies tend to have better economies because they tend to be market systems that are more open, capital can flow more easily. They also give you more choices every single day, right? Your choice to work or to live, you can get up and you can move to Colorado if you want to. You don't have to sign a paper, right? Or ask for permission. You can do those different kinds of things because your ability to freely move around is one of your rights, right? They have more stable laws, right? It's good for business if you have stable laws because everybody's planning around the stability and the certainty that a government can provide. You have also more stable governments overall. Democracies that are consolidated, like ours, tend to be more stable and dependable. Their citizens oftentimes live longer because they're better at increasing the development standards. And then you get cheeseburgers. It's one of the, it's up and down kind of thing, right? Education systems tend to be much better. And I think this is one of the other things we don't talk enough about, right? I mean, a lot of places in the world, and I'm saying this to a room full of educators, so I don't need to convince you, which makes me happy. But I think that there are so many places in the world in which education is not a right, it's not even guaranteed, it's a privilege given to a very few. And that dominates their ability to move upward. And it oftentimes means that the people who have the ability to be educated, those are the ones who are going to be the future leaders, and everybody else is going to be left at the bottom, right? It also, one of the things too, having worked in the intelligence community for a while, I, asked all these kinds of different questions, and I said to one person who was a CIA case officer, I was like, what is it that how do you get somebody to give you information? And they're like, there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't do, but one of the things we do that's really popular is we will pay for education for their kids in the United States. It's a very tempting thing. It works everywhere. We have a world-class higher education system, and people want a piece of it, right? We shouldn't take that for granted. And we can hold our leaders accountable. There are elections, and the outcome of the election is final. And one of the things that we don't invest in is losers' consent. This was something that was always a part of of democracy, which is, yeah, I lost, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to try again because I'm going to run this based on my ideas, right? That's the ideal situation. More effective bureaucracies. Your government does actually a lot of things. People love to complain about the government. It's a pastime. it does so many things you don't see every day, and it does a lot of them well. We have all kinds of things going on right now, including initiatives to take all the lead pipes out of the ground, right? We know we can't do that without a government bureaucracy, right? To make sure that your meat is inspected. We can't do that without a government bureaucracy. And so having a rules-based system that allows people to have confidence that the outcomes are going to be good is really important. But democracy is, at the end of the day, the thing you should care about. They offer a more free and just society, and you never know if you're going to be on the outs if you're not in democracy. Everybody should have a better opportunity. And I am glossing over there are a lot of problems, but here's the thing: we can talk about those problems. Right? I think that's a really important aspect. We can talk about those problems. We can point them out. We can criticize. We have that right and that ability. And I think oftentimes that leads to better outcomes, right? So I want to talk a little bit about external threats, and I don't want to take all the time here, but I want to go through these. I've got a couple of examples. The thing I can say at the top is these kinds of things have always happened. They happen all the time, and we certainly operate abroad in ways that try to that try to service our interests as well. And I don't want to gloss over that and pretend that doesn't happen. It certainly does. But I do want to talk about the fact that the world is changing in a very interesting way. In political science, we think about polarity in international relations. Sometimes it's called polarity, right? When in the 1990s, we were in a unipolar world. During the Cold War, it was a bipolar world, right? And the most dangerous configuration is the multipolar world, in which there are a number of very powerful states. And it's not so much the decline of the United States, but the rise of the rest that is creating a multipolar world. And if you are one of those other rising states, or a state that has a certain type of power you think you can leverage, what do you want to do? You want to bring down the most powerful part of the most powerful competitor, right? In the United States, we have a really interesting way of pursuing power, and one of those things is a robust network of allies, right? We have a whole bunch of other countries across the world who have said, we will go to war with you, we will trade with you, we will engage in diplomacy with you, and we have formal arrangements. And NATO is a good example of that, right? Bilateral relationships between Japan and South Korea and Australia. We share intelligence through the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are the British, the Kiwis, the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Canadians, and us, right? So the 5 English-speaking countries. If you go up to the U.S. Strategic Command right now, and you go in the basement, or all the way down there, you will find foreign liaison officers from a number of different countries who live in Omaha, Nebraska, and serve to coordinate those efforts. This is a really unique and important relationship that we have. And what it does is it allows us to project power and keep a lot of the conflict that would threaten us away from our shores, right? But if you are a major, we call them competitors now, if you are a major competitor, like the Russians or the Chinese, you understand that one of the biggest vulnerabilities is not their military. That's going to be a tough thing to defeat. But if you can defeat the people who live in the democracy, you can make them think that their government or their country is not good, then you can defeat them from inside. No, they think of that as a weakness, right? I think of it as a condition of having to live in an open society. And it's worth the price. It's worth the price. We just have to be better about educating ourselves. But let's talk about how they do it. There's a couple of formal threats, informal threats, and I think at the end of the day, they see it that if we lose, they win, right? And you hear this in their rhetoric. You hear it when Putin talks, you hear it when Xi talks, you hear it when their government officials below that talk. This is what they're talking about. Formal threats are formal interference in elections and affairs of state, right? Aggressive military threats, invasions. Right now, the Russians are putting a ton of pressure, not just because of what they've done in Ukraine, but the Polish government is, and I saw another article today, the Polish government is very, very concerned, right? And so are the Baltic states. Informal threats, like in influence campaigns. We'll talk about how that works in just a second. Killing of foreign dissidents living in democracies. The Russians, the North Koreans, the Chinese have all done this. crackdowns at home, support for other autocracies. And again, this is a zero-sum game to them. So they think that fundamentally our system of government is a weakness, and that it's a vulnerability for us. And I think they're wrong about that, by the way. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because I want to save more time for questions, but this was one that just made news yet again this week with the passage of new national security laws inside of Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was handed over in 1997 from the British, this was going to be a big test for the Chinese, right? The test was, could the Chinese absorb what is a functional democracy into their system and maintain that level of freedom, right? And there was kind of a belief, or at least a hope, that they would. And that they would be able to separate their system from the Hong Kong system and let the Hong Kong system kind of thrive. And we were disabused of the fact that they would do this despite guarantees relatively quickly, right? Hong Kong had a vibrant free press, Hong Kong had elected local officials, but most importantly, they had a culture that embraced democratic values, right? People of Hong Kong thought of themselves as living in a democracy. And there was sort of a demise of that movement that happened through force, it happened through laws, coercion, all kinds of other things. And like I said, it's a big and important story, and if you've been paying attention to it, there's the pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong are yet to sort of win a battle. And the mainland policies are the ones that are being put into place. They, throughout the government, install people that are friendly to the mainland, and then they, through what is now becoming increasingly fragile democratic processes, are passing additional laws that will make it more and more difficult for any kind of opposition. And now you can be, they've gutted their independent media. You can be charged with subversion over things that the mainland government essentially doesn't like. This is one thing that I think is worth talking about in more deeply, and I'm going to, like I said, we're going to do wave tops today just to kind of give you a survey of the different things that are out there. I was just recently on vacation with my family, and we came back and we have global entry, which I think is just a wonderful thing, because if I didn't have it, I never would have made my plane to come home. Why is it so fast? It's so fast because instead of standing in a line to get my passport stamp, I walk up and a computer finds my face and is like, you are who you say you are, go. You are who my son walks up, and he's got all this energy, so I'm like, hey, the computer's still, like, I can't, he's a blur to me, right? And they were still able to get him. Now, we opted into this system. We opted into the system because they're going to look at me when I'm coming in and out, and it's going to expedite the process. And they have to know that I'm me when I come in anyway, right? That's just the way that it works. They stamp your passport and on you go. Imagine having that system where you've not consented to it, and it is on every block of the city that you live in. They know where you're moving, they know where you're going, they know when you're going, they know what you're wearing, they know who you're with, right? The Chinese government itself, had a goal by 2018 to have 200 million cameras inside of their cities. They started this out mostly in Uyghur areas and in Tibet and other places where they thought they were going to have dissent. This since moving into their broader society. They had a program called Skynet, which again, if you know anything about popular culture, that was the thing that created the Terminators, right? I would have stayed away from that. Apparently, the Chinese version is different. One of the things that's really concerning is the Sharp Eyes, which was a program to basically cover 100% of public space by 2020. So, as you're walking around, they know where you are and when you're there at all times. They have the ability to do that, and it's biometric data now too, right? So this is what it looks like. You walk around and you've got these little green squares around you. Well, there's a computer that has mapped your face, and it is taking a look at it and then comparing different points where how far your eyes are apart, what your nose looks like, all those different kinds of things, and then positively identifying you. And they moved on to things like social credit scores, which at first caused controversy, but now they've been able to move ahead more. They watch when you're on the internet, they want to know what you're looking at, right? They want to know if you're paying your party dues. They want to know where your money's going. So you earn money, and they know how you're spending it. And then they compare that to what they sort of consider to be their ideal citizen, and if you're doing the things they want you to do, your social credit score goes up. If you're not doing the things they want you to do, it goes down, and that can cost your kids the ability to get to the school they want to get into, it will cost you the ability to get the job that you want, right? So this is becoming a totalitarian kind of state. And the Chinese, I think, in their mind, the way they talk about it is this provides security, right? This provides certainty. But the reality is that now you've lost a lot of your, sort of personal autonomy, which I think for us would be much more traumatic. It's not that it's not traumatic for them, but imagine going from what you have today to that. But this is what I was talking about earlier with the notion that we had for a long time that we could use technology to make the world freer. The Chinese are now exporting a lot of this technology to places that want to use it to make the world less free. Right? And I think this is something to pay attention to because, like I said, I did it at the airport. It's one go and I consented to it. But there are plenty of opportunities to use these kinds of surveillance, and there will be people who will advocate for it. And there might even be, you think good reasons that might make it safe, but we have to think about what are the consequences to our freedom. 2016 election interference, right? This is a fairly well-known case. The Russian disinformation and American disinformation, going back and forth, has a long history. We had Radio Free America, and we would, beam details of wonderful American life into the Soviet system. The Soviets, for a long time, they played in the 1970s. They played very heavily on racial divides inside the United States. Because we're an open society, it makes it easier for them to have access to this. The Project Latka was this project very specifically to favor one political candidate over another in 2016 that Putin preferred. And they did it in a much more organized way than what we had seen before. And how do we know about this? The US intelligence community was following this. The thing that I find most interesting is we had 26 indicted Russians. Do you know how we found a lot of those Russians? Does anyone know? They're all working at this place called the Internet Research Agency, or the IRA, which again, they're not a good acronym, It has a history. They created this thing called a troll farm, in which there were people posing, and I saw one of these things. I'm a housewife from Nebraska, and I think this, right? And it wasn't so much even just to bolster one side or the other, but it was to create disinformation and anger amongst the population, right? They found one instance in which they were able to get a Black Lives Matter protest started across the street from a MAGA rally, right? And no American individual was involved in the organization of that. And so what does it do? It sets you up against somebody that you don't like, and it's going to cause more consternation and chaos, right? The idea here is, yes, you want to point people in one direction, but you really want to gut their belief in the system, right? You want to make them think that their government isn't good. You want to make them think the United States is broken. You want to do all these different kinds of things. We found out because the US IC was able to sort of understand where these IP addresses were going. They were masking them. They weren't doing a very good job. We ended up being able to indict them because the Dutch would have a very good counter cyber capability. Figured out how to look at the cameras on all their computers in their little troll farm in Russia, and they were watching them do it. So they had been able to hack into their computers and actually watch them working every day. And so some of those are the pictures that showed up in the indictments, right? But this is a problem. The United States at this time we're enamored with social media, and for whatever reason, a whole bunch of us think that everything on there is more on edge and more angry. And so we were all consuming a whole bunch of things that was having an impact on us and our faith in the system that was not coming from other Americans. It was very specifically targeted to us by a foreign government in order to make us not hold our government or our civil servants or the other party or other human beings that we happen to know in high regard. And then, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the invasion of Ukraine. I think the one important takeaway here is that when the invasion of Ukraine happened, Ukraine had twice essentially voted to not lean towards Russia, but to start leaning towards Europe. Ukrainians are amazing. Like, I spent time in Poland, but Like the Ukrainians, they're good at adopting technology. They're hardworking people, and there's a real future for them in the European Union. And Zelensky represented a real desire to move away from Russian influence and towards Russia. And I could do a whole thing on this, but I think the important thing that you need to know was that what Putin said was going on in Ukraine was clearly a front for naked military aggression. And if we believe Zelensky, 70,000+ Ukrainian soldiers have died. I personally believe that number is higher. And 180,000 Russian soldiers have died. So the human cost is very high, and that's not even talking about casualties, civilian casualties, and the fact that the Russians have one of the largest nuclear reactors in the world under their control right now, and God knows what they're going to do with it. Let's talk a little bit internal things. I'm going to give you hopefully something positive to walk away from this with, and then I'll take. No, this is like between my wife and I, we sit down at dinner, and it's kind of like, so you dealt with tough stuff all day, and I'm watching a car crash that happens every single day. I can't do anything. So I'm thinking about how we can think about these things in a way that gives us agency, right? That makes us empowered. But we have to understand what's going on, right? We have to understand what the problem is. There are internal threats inside the United States. And I think some of the stuff that the influence campaigns were getting at were these deeper issues inside of American society and culture. And it's not just happening here. And on the next slide, which is the second to last, I'm going to show you that it's happening in a lot of Western countries right now. I talked about executive overreach a little bit, election manipulation, certainly these ideas that elections are rigged. And I saw that, I think Katie Porter from California made an accusation the other day. So now it's kind of in both political camps, perhaps. The decline of civil rights protections, the rolling back of rights in some states, misinformation, conspiracy theories, I think are doing a lot of work for the sort of anti-democratic forces and political polarization, which I think is really important. So I just want to point out some places where it's getting harder to vote and places where it's getting easier to vote, because it's not all going in one direction, right? You can see here, after the gutting of the Civil Rights, of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in, 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, a whole bunch of states took the opportunity to make it very much more difficult to vote. And if you actually look at what they did, they went in particularly into minority-serving areas and closed down precincts, and they closed down your access to ballots, made it very difficult. You had to wait in line. I think in Georgia, people were waiting in line. Churches were coming out and giving people water and food. They tried to outlaw that because the lines to get in to vote were like 12 hours long. So they really were going to try to make it more difficult to do it. Other places are making it easier. I think in Oregon, it's automatic voter registration. I think every single person who is old enough can just show up and vote. Even Nebraska, Oklahoma have moved things, I think, in the right direction. But things like voter ID laws, I think there's a principled argument for it, but I think the way that it's used oftentimes is to undermine elderly voters and voters of color or poor voters, and shrinking the amount of access and time for ballots. I think this is a really big one. But like I said, this isn't all bad news. This is now a real controversial topic, and it's gaining a lot of attention inside of states, and I think that's a good conversation to be having. But overall, we see that a lot of states have sort of moved in the wrong direction. I think one of the big things is political polarization. If you go back to the 1980s and even 1990s, the distance between the parties, your median Democrat and median Republican, they're pretty close. There are liberal Republicans, and there are conservative Democrats, right? And growing up as a kid, we elected a bunch of conservative Democrats, for governor and Senate and all those kinds of things, right? Those people don't really exist anymore, as the two sides have begun to split apart. Even in 2004 it was closer, but we see, and this is old data, this is 10 years old, and I can tell you that the newer stuff has the gap between the median voters even further apart. And if you look at the way that And again, there's a lot of really good political science on all of this stuff, but if we look at how far apart, this is the Senate, this is the House, and you can see this happens right around 1994. I kind of go back to the beginning of the polarization debate, and I really look at sort of the Newt Gingrich, Bill Clinton era, and to me that's where a lot of this stuff starts. But this has created so many problems because now all of a sudden we don't trust one another. Right? You look, a record number of Republicans and Democrats both say that the other party is a danger to the country. Right? We're unable to make those connections. And I also think things like talk radio, cable news, social media, all of these different things allow people to live in a bubble that confirms their deepest suspicions about the other. And this is a real problem because we're not having those conversations with one another, and we're making politics the most important and defining factor of our relationships with other people. And that's usually not the case. But that's kind of where we are right now. But it can happen anywhere. And if you look at this is support for authoritarianism in middle-income countries. And 32% in the United States? That should scare the living daylights out of me. I mean, at least it does out of me, right? But if we look at, Viktor Orban, interesting story. He started out as a leftist, and sort of reinvented himself, but he has firm control over Hungarian politics and the media, right? And he's eroded a lot of the democratic systems that were put in place in the 1990s. Recep Tayyip Erdogan from Turkey. Again, you saw on the graph how far sort of back towards an authoritarian space that he's moved them. This is Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. He's now the prime minister. His group has won the controlling stake in Dutch politics. He wants to tax burqas and he wants to kick people out of the country. He's very much a Eurosceptic. This is Duda in Poland and Bolsonaro in Brazil. And neither one of them, Duda is on his way out. Tusk won the last election. And I just, 3 weeks before spring break, I was talking with a Polish activist. And they were saying that, and the same thing happened in Brazil, that there was a backlash to the backlash. And that's why they're not there anymore. But these are people who they're touching on something inside of these societies that has really resonated, right? They're the outcome of a populist backlash to globalization, to all kinds of other things. But at the end of the day, if you look at where they're moving the dial, they're moving it towards fewer rights for people as opposed to more rights for people. So what's at stake? Minority rights are critical for all of us. There are a lot of good arguments out there, and I know this is an old book now, but it wasn't old when I read it. Democracy and human rights, I think these two things go together. And William F. Schultz wrote a book called In Our Own Best Interest. And I think he really does a good job of basically saying, protecting other people's human rights protects your own human rights. Protecting other people's ability to participate in the system protects your ability to participate in the system, right? And you don't want the government to be able to persecute you for arbitrary reasons. Just because you are not of the right political stripe, or you don't have the right skin color, or you don't have the right religious background, you don't want that, because you never know when it's going to be you. Authoritarianism will oftentimes restrict your ability to do the things that you want to do. I don't think we think about this enough. We want a parsimonious, simple explanation for the way the world is, and we want someone to come in and fix it. Always be aware of simplicity. Nothing is simple. Things are very, very difficult. They're always hard. In a democracy, you at least get to talk about it, right? You at least get to try. And you're going to screw up a whole bunch of times. You also have to understand that you're going to mess up, right? And I think our national interests are deeply harmed by retrenchment, by turning away. The allies that we have are very important to our own national interests, particularly in our own safety. So what can you do about it? This is the last slide, and then I will take it, because I know I've gone over, and I apologize for that. I was writing this last night with a 7-year-old hanging on me. Dad, I'm busy. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What can you do about it? This is a social threat, but it requires individual effort. Democracies require individuals to do their fair part, their fair share. You have to do the work. We all have to do the work, right? What does that mean? Assess your information. There's so much out there, and most of it's garbage, right? I sound like, when I put this together, I was like, I feel like a dietitian. Stay away from the butter and the simple flour, right? But read newspapers and respected magazines. Some newspapers lean left, some newspapers lean right. Find the ones that lean and not the ones that are bent over like this, right? It's okay to kind of go back and forth. Limit or turn off your cable news. If you are not paying for your media, then you are the product. They are selling you because you are the person sitting in front of their infomercial or whatever they're showing at commercial break. And how are they doing that? They're doing it by making you scared, by making you anxious, by making you worried because your cortisol levels go up, your attention level goes up. We're not meant for this environment. Our brains do not work here. Our brains are for roaming around on the plains and avoiding saber-toothed tigers, right? Like that's what they're literally built for. And so when they're like, oh my God, these people are going to come and they're going to get you, then all of a sudden, oh, you have my attention, right? Know that they're manipulating you. They don't really have your best interest in mind if you're not paying for it. And even when you're paying for it, be careful what you're buying. But listen to others. Listen to others and find a way to disagree with them in a way that preserves your dignity, your common dignity, and your common humanity. This has to be the most important thing that you do. And some people will never give you the grace that you deserve, that they deserve, but give it to them anyway. Being the bigger person is not just about being the bigger person, it's about serving your community in a kind of a way, right? Acknowledge that people see the world differently, and that's okay. I had looked at a lot of survey data. The things that are freaking out Republicans and conservatives, and the things that are freaking out liberals and Democrats. And both of them are completely earnest in their views. They're just seeing the world differently. Note that sometimes it's not that people are wrong, they're just looking at things differently. Try to find where that common ground is. And have hope. None of this is deterministic, right? We have a choice here. Do something that can make the world a better place. And I talk to a lot of people who go out and they volunteer. You're going to feel better about the world if you're giving something back to it. You know, that's an immediate thing you can do, because when you're looking at politics today and you're worried about things, what are you doing? You're worrying about things you can't control. So much of the stuff you can't control. But there's some things you can control, and you have to focus on those things. And I would say, finally, drink lots of water, get plenty of sleep, be kind to one another, right? I think these are all positive things that you can do. Okay, I know I've gone over, so I apologize. I know it's a very simplistic overview, but thank you for your attention.